Hello. For our first new Winter Zoom embroidery series of 2023, I'm going to make two videos. This first one is for you beginners out there. So this is going to go over some very basic things, plus a couple of basic stitches that you'll want to know if you're doing embroidery, like if you order a kit or something, there's a couple stitches you'll want to know that we're not going to go over right away in class. So the first thing I'm going to start with, I'm going to try to make this quick, is organizing your thread. So if you got a kit, you got skeins of thread like this, or you can buy it like this at the store. And you can also buy these little plastic organizers. They have these two little slots in them up here. You can make these out of cardboard. Just cut out a piece of corrugated cardboard and cut two little slits in the top for organizing. This is really handy. So you've got your skein of thread like this. If you just pull on this little end here, you might be sad because it can get very, very tangled. So if you're an organized person and you want to have everything in order and not be hung up with tangled threads, this is a little time consuming, but it's worth the effort. So got your skein. You're going to pull off your two little paper labels. Just so you know, these are DMC brand, but there's many brands, but they'll have a little number on them. So if you're in the middle of a project and you run out of this thread, if you've held on to this, you'll know, oh, this is number 919, I can get more. You can write that on your little organizer. So I've opened up my skein. Now, carefully, I want to pull this apart. And I can see here that this one here isn't quite open. So I want to get it so that it's all one piece going around in one big loop is the idea here. What's this? This is an end. Okay. So I think I got pretty lucky. That was pretty easy to do. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take my little plastic doohickey here and I'm going to run this piece through the little slit, and then I'm just going to wrap the whole thing around this until my entire skein is around this. And then when I get to the end, I'm going to just pop it through this other one and it'll keep it in place. I can just keep it wherever I want. Okay. I'm not going to make you watch me do that whole thing, but that's how you do that. And again, highly recommend. I'm actually quite terrible about it, and I end up with a plastic bag full of all of these and they get tangled up, and it's bad news. So, you see my little tiny scissors here. If you end up loving embroidery and you want to really get into it, I would highly recommend a little pair of embroidery scissors, because the cleaner cut you have on your thread, the easier it's going to be to thread your needles. Okay, so I'm actually going to show you how to do that next. All right, now little tip here. Unless you're doing like a very small piece and you know you don't need much thread, a good rule of thumb is to have your thread that you're sewing with be no longer than the tip of your finger to your shoulder, because you don't want to have to be pulling these long bits of thread. The more wear and tear you get on your thread, the more times you pull it through your fabric, it's going to get sort of frayed like frizzy hair. So it's better to really just sort of stick to this length and then just add more. If you run out before you're done with the section you're working on, just add more. That's easy enough to do. So got my nice sharp scissors. Gonna give that a little trim. I recommend sucking on the end of your thread. It's a little bit gross. If that grosses you out, get a little cup of water that you can dip your thread in and then pull it with your fingers. It really helps to have your thread wet. And of course, this is always handy. So I wet it, and I'm going to just sort of pinch it so that it's nice and flat. Okay. The mistake that people make when they're just starting out, here's my needle, is that they try to thread the thread through the eye of the needle. And that's really difficult. This is flimsy. You really have to have great eyesight. But the truth is you can thread your needle without really looking. So my thread is wet. I've pinched it flat. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull it so that it's just barely sticking out of my fingers. Then I'm going to align my needle so that the hole is facing the thread. And then I'm just going to, no, you didn't see that, but it went right in. Okay. If I had been trying to go thread through the needle, it would have been really difficult. I'm trying to do that closer for you. Okay, pinching it very, very close, lining this up. It's like when I go like this, you can't even see it, but it's there. Okay. Oops, I missed. So that's hard to do so far away. This embroidery floss that comes on the skein is actually 6 threads all together. And I'm not going to do it right now, but later on in our classes, I'm going to show you how to split these so that you can work with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever you want. There we go, right through. Okay. So when I am sewing, when I'm doing my embroidery, all right, I've got my long piece here. Remember, this was tipped, fingertip to shoulder. What I'm going to do is I'm going to pull a little tail here, and I want my tail to be about like 1/3 to half the length of the piece of thread that I'm going to sew with. Okay. I'm going to tie a knot in the end of the long bit. One knot is usually enough. If you're using a really wide weave fabric, you might need to do a double knot. Okay. And I'm going to sew with this, and I'm just going to be keeping an eye on the tail. Oops. Oh dear, I've done a thing. I always do a thing when I'm making an instructional video. Ah! All right, look, I got a big tangle. It's because I'm hurrying. That's okay. I'm going to do another one really, really quick. I'm going to pause the video and come back with a threaded needle. Okay, so I think what I was saying that is if you have a really wide weave fabric, you want to maybe do a double knot on your thread here. But most fabrics, a single knot of 6 strands of embroidery floss will be just fine. So I switched to my overhead camera, and what I'm going to show you how to do now is load the fabric onto your embroidery hoop. Okay, so your hoop is made up of 2 bamboo or little wooden hoops. They make them plastic. If you got a kit, it's this kind. The plastic ones are pretty slippery. I would actually recommend these more unless you need a specialty hoop shape for some reason. So you're going to take the hoop that does not have the screw on it. That's the inner hoop. You're going to lay it down. You're going to take your fabric and lay it centered over the top of your hoop. You're going to take the one with the screw, which changes size, and you're going to push it gently over the inner hoop. Okay, and then you're going to tighten this screw. You can sort of pull on your fabric to make sure it's nice and tight. Okay, and you want this to be like taut like a drum, but you don't want to pull it so tight that it like stretches your threads. And or if you've done a drawing on here, if you pull so tight that your drawing gets warped, you're a little too tight. Okay, but again, you want to go for that little drum tautness. Okay. So now I'm ready to sew. I've got my needle threaded, and I've got my tail of my thread is about half the length of my sewing thread. And I'm just going to keep an eye on that. Most of the time, it's not an issue. If this is sort of slipping, you can kind of pinch down here to make sure that your needle doesn't come unthreaded. But it's not a big deal if it does come unthreaded. So I'm going to show you 2 stitches that we're not going to go over right away in class. This is a disappearing ink pen. It's purple. They're usually purple, or maybe you have one that's purple on one end and blue on the other. This is air soluble ink. So if I draw on this fabric, it's possible that my line will go away in 5 minutes. It's possible it'll last a couple of weeks. It just depends on like the type of fabric. Maybe it depends on the humidity in the air. I'm not actually sure. I haven't been able to figure out what makes this kind of ink go away. If it never disappears with the air, it's also water soluble. So you can dab some water on here and the ink should go right away. If you got a kit, you have one of these Friction, that's the name brand, Friction heat soluble pens. Okay. I tested this on our fabric, drew all over it, hit it with a blow dryer, ink is gone. From what I read, if I put my fabric in the freezer, the ink lines are going to come right back. So for our embroidery, that's no problem. If you're going to be making a white skirt that you're going to wear in the winter outside, don't use this pen to make your lines because they'll come back in the cold. Okay, so I like to draw what I'm going to embroider first. I find it very helpful because a lot of what we do is we're filling in shapes or we're following lines. So I'm going to show you 2 line stitches. The basic one is just sewing. It's called the running stitch. And I'm going to do it following this line. So if you've ever like sewn anything, or if you took home ec classes, you know the running stitch. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start under the fabric. I've already tied a knot in my needle. You can see me dragging my needle around here. It's sometimes hard to find your line, and that's okay. So I'm going to start here at the end of my line. I'm going to pull my thread through. Really important thing, you want to check and make sure that your knot is pulled taut against the back of your fabric. If you start sewing and this is kind of hanging loose, it could affect the tension on your thread later, and it's also going to get in your way. So just make sure that that's nice and taut. Okay. Now I'm going to refer a lot in our class to a stitch length. The stitch length is up to you. So if you want your stitches to be really long, I could go in here. That's 1 stitch length if that's what I choose. Or I could be really short. Typically a shorter stitch length is going to look neater, but the key is really to be consistent. So whatever you choose, try to stick with that. So I'm going to go with this stitch length. Okay. So I'm going to put my needle in on my line. I'm going to pull my thread through. Now, when I flip this over, I can tell I loosened this. So for your first couple of stitches, always be checking this knot and make sure it's staying put. Okay. For the running stitch, we're going to skip 1 stitch length underneath. So I'm going to come back up on my line, aiming for the same stitch length as the thread you can see. Going back down 1 stitch length. Okay. Gonna double check that. Looking good back here. All right, I'm feeling good about that. I feel like it's gonna stay put now. Whoops, I'm a little off my line, so that's okay. I'm gonna move. I'm just gonna come back over, up 1 stitch length. If you're gonna be sewing a running stitch on a curved line, you want to definitely shorten your stitch length so that you can get a visual line. Okay, when you're doing anything on a curve, shorter stitches are always better visually. And that goes with pretty much any stitch you're doing. Okay, so this is it. This is the running stitch. I'm going to show you the pro move on the running stitch. So when I say pro move, it means it's quicker, but it sometimes takes some practice. So pro move is to come down on my line 1 stitch length, and in 1 motion, come back up 1 stitch length. Okay, so I'm saving myself pulling the thread all the way through the back and then all the way up through the front. Not only is this faster, it saves wear and tear on my thread. Okay, I'll do that one more time. Down on my line, 1 stitch length, same motion, up on my line, 1 stitch length. Okay. And that's it. Now I'm going to show you how to knot off. So to finish this, I'm going to go down 1 more stitch length, come up through the back. Okay. And this is how you tie a knot on the back of your fabric. You're going to find the closest stitch, which in this case is right here. I'm going to slide my needle under the thread without penetrating the fabric. I'm going to make a loop just like I'm like tying my shoe. Okay. I'm just going to pull on that. And I like to, what am I trying to say? I get a little nervous and I like to do it twice sometimes to make sure it's really tied. If your stitches have a space between them, I would recommend a double. If the stitch was really close to it, a single's usually fine. I've got that. Okay. Now it's tied and I can trim my thread. Okay. And now I'm going to show you the back stitch. And before I start that, I'm going to tie another knot in my thread to get started. Flip this over. I'm going to draw myself another line for the back stitch. Okay. Back stitch is very similar. It starts the same way. Sort of checking this. My tail's getting a little long. My thread's getting a little short. That's okay. So plenty for what we're doing. So knot in my thread. I'm going to come up at the end of my line. Double checking that my knot is taut here. Looks good. Now, just like my running stitch, I'm going to go forward 1 stitch. All right, check, knot still taut. That's great. All right, now, just like my running stitch, I'm going to come up one stitch length away on my line. Okay, but instead of going forward, this is called the back stitch, I'm going to go back. One stitch length. I'm going to go down into the same hole that this one went in or right next to it so that it looks like it's the same place. As close as I can get. Depends on your fabric and your thread if you can go down in the exact same hole. Checking things back here. Everything looks good back here, nice and clean still. Okay, now I'm going to come up one stitch length on my line, which underneath is actually 2 stitch lengths because I went down back here. But visually, I'm coming up 1 stitch length, going back 1 stitch length in the same place. Okay. I'll do one more. Back 1 stitch length. Okay, let's say that's as far as I want to go. Now, I find my closest stitch, which is right here. So I'm going to loop under it. And I'm going to go through the hoop, through the loop. Okay, and that's all I have to do. I've tied a knot. Okay. That's that. I'm going to show you a little decorative element real quick that you can do. I'm going to get a different color of thread. We'll go with this green here. Let's see if I can show you the needle threading trick on this overhead camera. That might be better. All right, I've licked the end of my thread. I'm squeezing it flat. I've got it so it's just barely poking out. I'm lining up my needle. I'm pinching all 6 of those threads and pulling them through. And you know what? I think I missed one. Yep, I missed one here, and that's okay. So this is what happened before when I got a little tangled. I don't care that I'm only going to have 5 threads instead of 6. I'm just going to gently pull that out of there. No biggie. Oop. Okay. All right, I'm going to tie a knot. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to come at the end of my line so I can feel under here that my knot from where I started is getting in my way a little bit. Here we go. So I'm coming up. And I'm going to work on top of the fabric from here on out. I'm not going to be penetrating the fabric with my needle. And sometimes it's easier to do that by leading with the eye of your needle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run my green thread under the loop of my brown thread, the whole needle underneath like this. And I'm just doing like a little barber pole effect here. And this is called whipping. I am whipping my back stitch. Okay, and then you get this cute little decorative effect. When I get to the end of my line, I'm just going to put my needle in at the end here. Okay, and then I've got a little whipped back stitch. You can do that with a running stitch as well, where when you're whipping it, you're going under from the right and over to the left, under from the right, over to the left, under from the right, over to the left. So you're whipping your thread around the existing thread, always in the same direction. Okay. I'm just going to skip knotting this for the sake of time, but I am going to tie another new knot in it because I'm going to show you a different version of that over here on our running stitch. So this was whipping. Remember, we went from the same side every time, under the thread from the right, over the top, under the right, over the top. So what I'm going to do now is called a woven effect. So I'm going to do a woven running stitch now. I'm going to come up at the end, my needle. And for a woven one, just like when you're weaving like on a loom, you're going to go back and forth. So for this one, I'm going to change directions when I go underneath my thing. So I'm going to lead with my eye, and I'm going to go under my stitch on the right, and I'm going to switch, and I'm going to go under on the left on the next one. So weaving is back and forth, woven goes the same way. Okay, so this is a way to get a very full line and add some additional color to your running stitch. Another fun thing you can do with this is you can play with the tension and you can get a nice loopy effect here. So if I leave these loose, so my tail is now the same length as my thread, which isn't good because I'm going to start sewing with both of them. So I'm just going to hold that and I'm going to shorten my tail a little bit so I don't accidentally sew with two threads. All right, so back and forth. The trickiest part about this is keeping your tension even on your little loop-de-doops. Okay. That got a little bit tight. That's okay. I'm just going to loosen those up. All right, and now I'm at the end, so I'm just going to put my needle back through. Okay, and that is a woven running stitch. And again, I could weave my back stitch as well if I wanted to. Now, when I've got all of these loose loops over here, you want to be careful when you're tying your knot, because if I pull too hard when I'm tying my knot, I'll tighten my loops. So I'm sort of putting my finger here and pushing tight to keep that like that, the tension I want, and then I'm going to run this through here. And again, I'm just sort of holding on to this to make sure that I'm not pulling too tight on that knot. Or I cut it, double checking that I didn't make my loops funny. I didn't, so I'm all good. That is that. So again, this was just a sort of a starter video for those of you that are brand new. There'll be a second video for our first class where we go over the stitches that we learned from the Mexican embroidery. Thanks.